Objection, Your Honor. This boy is making an absolute mockery of this courtroom and the judicial process. The elite attorney snarled, her voice sharp enough to cut glass as she slammed her leather briefcase shut with a resounding crack. Overruled, Miss Hill, the judge fired back, his gavel hovering in the air, his eyes locked entirely on the 19-year-old standing stoically at the defense table. Let the kid speak. I want to hear exactly where he's going with this. They thought Richard Evans was just another uneducated kid from the projects, a scared, helpless target to steamroll out of his family's generational home so they could build another high-rise. They were dead wrong. Behind his oversized, thrift store suit and quiet demeanor was a mind sharper and more ruthless than any Ivy League graduate in the city. Today, this courtroom wasn't going to host an eviction, it was about to witness an absolute massacre. The atmosphere inside the historic Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse at Foley Square was suffocatingly heavy, a physical weight pressing down on anyone who dared enter without a law degree. The grand mahogany walls, polished to a dark, judgmental mirror shine, seemed to loom over the participants like silent sentinels of the state. The air smelled of old parchment, institutional floor wax, and the distinct, sour metallic scent of nervous sweat that lingered in the gallery. It was a room specifically built to intimidate, designed architecturally to make the average citizen feel incredibly small, ignorant, and insignificant. And standing at the defense table, looking as jarringly out of place as a stray dog at a pedigree show, was 19-year-old Richard Evans. Richard was wearing a faded navy blue suit he had bought for exactly $12.50 at a Goodwill store in Harlem. The stiff polyester sleeves were a fraction too short, exposing his bony wrists, the shoulders were slightly too wide, making him look even younger than he was, and the collar of his stiff white shirt was frayed at the edges from years of previous wear. His tie, a muted burgundy with a faint, unidentifiable stain near the bottom, was tied with meticulous, almost desperate care. Next to him sat his grandmother, Eleanor Evans, a fragile 70-year-old woman with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, clutching a worn leather Bible so tightly her knuckles were translucent white. Her hands trembled constantly with the sheer, paralyzing terror of losing the only home she had known for 40 years, the home where she had raised 3 children, the home where her late husband had proposed to her on the front porch. Across the aisle, occupying the plaintiff's table like royalty surveying a freshly conquered land, sat Jasmine Hill. Jasmine was a senior partner at Vanguard and Associates, one of Manhattan's most ruthless, unapologetic corporate law firms. She was 38, dressed in a custom-tailored, charcoal gray Armani suit that cost more than Richard's grandmother made in a year, and radiated an aura of predatory, impenetrable confidence. Her assistants scurried around her, terrified to make a sound, while her stilettos clicked against the marble floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. She was known in elite legal circles as the Black Widow of real estate, a lawyer who specialized in finding and exploiting microscopic legal loopholes to forcefully evict vulnerable, low-income homeowners and pave the way for massive luxury high-rises. To her, Richard and his weeping grandmother were not human beings with memories and heartbeats, they were merely negative numbers on a corporate spreadsheet, minor inconveniences standing in the way of a multi-million-dollar gentrification project in Brooklyn. Presiding over the courtroom from his elevated oak bench was Judge Harold Thornton, a veteran jurist with 30 years of experience and a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of unprepared lawyers. Judge Thornton was a strict, no-nonsense constitutionalist who despised wasted time, sloppy arguments, and theatrical stunts. When he peered over his half-moon spectacles at the courtroom, his eyes immediately dismissed Richard. He didn't see a defender, he saw a frightened kid playing lawyer. Completely out of his depth. Case number 44B, Vanguard Holdings vs. Eleanor Evans. Judge Thornton's voice boomed, echoing ominously off the high, vaulted ceilings. I see the defendant has elected to proceed pro se. Mr. Evans, you are 19 years old. You are not a licensed attorney in the state of New York. You are attempting to defend a highly complex property rights dispute involving a $2 million piece of prime real estate against a top-tier firm. Are you absolutely certain you do not want to request a temporary continuance to secure public counsel? The court is willing to grant you 30 days. I am certain, Your Honor, Richard said. His voice was quiet, respectful, but it didn't shake. Not even a millimeter. Jasmine Hill let out a soft, mocking sigh, perfectly calibrated to be loud enough for the court reporter and the judge to hear. She leaned back in her plush leather chair, twirling a solid gold fountain pen between her perfectly manicured fingers. "Your Honor," Jasmine purred, standing up with a theatrical, condescending flourish, "while I applaud the young man's bravery and his obvious dedication to his grandmother, this is a straightforward case of foreclosure due to severely defaulted loans. Vanguard Holdings legally acquired the deed to the property when Mrs. Evans failed to meet her financial obligations for 6 consecutive months. We have the signed documents. We are asking for an immediate summary judgment so we can proceed with the eviction. This boy is simply delaying the inevitable and dragging out his grandmother's pain." Judge Thornton looked down at Richard, his expression softening with a mixture of profound pity and growing annoyance. "Mr. Evans, the plaintiff has presented a physically signed deed and a certified record of defaulted payments. The law is rigid. It is blind. It does not care about your grandmother's sentimental attachment to the house or your family's history there, unless you have a specific, actionable legal defense grounded in state law. I will have no choice but to rule in favor of the plaintiff and order the property vacated." Richard didn't flinch. He didn't look at Jasmine's mocking smirk, nor did he look down at his trembling grandmother. He looked straight at the judge, his posture straightening. He opened his worn, cracked plastic folder. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice suddenly shifting, carrying a resonant, commanding weight that seemed entirely unnatural for a teenager, "the defense does not dispute that the payments stopped. We acknowledge the financial record. What the defense disputes is the validity of the contract itself, under the grounds of fraud in the factum, and a direct, calculated violation of New York civil practice law and rules, Section 3016, B, which mandates that causes of action based on fraud must be pleaded with exquisite particularity." The courtroom went instantly, shockingly dead silent. The court reporter's fingers paused, hovering completely still over her steno machine. Judge Thornton's thick eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. At the plaintiff's table, Jasmine Hill's golden pen abruptly stopped twirling, slipping slightly in her grip. The vocabulary, the exact citation, the flawless, unhesitating pronunciation, it was absolutely jarring. It was not what anyone expected from the impoverished kid in the oversized thrift store suit. "Excuse me, Mr. Evans?" The judge leaned forward, gripping his gavel, his pity evaporating into sharp intrigue. "I have the floor, Your Honor, and I intend to prove that Vanguard Holdings did not simply purchase a bad debt. They orchestrated a highly sophisticated, predatory scam targeting the elderly," Richard said, his dark eyes burning with a cold, terrifying intelligence. "And I intend to prove, with documentary evidence, that Miss Jasmine Hill was not just the lawyer on this case, but the primary architect of the entire fraud." To understand exactly how a 19-year-old kid from the projects knew the intricate, labyrinthine depths of the CPLR, one had to look back at the agonizing previous 3 months of Richard's life. Richard was never a normal kid. Diagnosed at age 7 with hyperthymesia, an extremely rare neurological condition allowing a person to recall almost every moment of their life in perfect, unbroken detail, Richard possessed a photographic memory so sharp, so relentless, it bordered on a superpower. He couldn't afford college tuition, but his mind was an endless, bottomless sponge. He didn't just read words, he downloaded them permanently into his cerebral cortex. When the thick, certified eviction notice had arrived taped to his grandmother's door 90 days ago, Eleanor had collapsed in the hallway and wept, believing her failing eyesight had caused her to accidentally sign her house away in a confusing, predatory refinancing deal. Seeing the woman who raised him broken and terrified ignited something primal in Richard. He had sworn on his life to protect her. Unable to afford even a basic consultation with a lawyer, Richard had turned to the only free sanctuary he knew, the New York Public Library's main branch on Fifth Avenue. Every single day for 3 grueling months, from the moment the heavy brass doors unlocked in the morning until the security guards physically escorted him out at midnight, Richard practically lived in the legal reference section. He sat beneath the iconic green lamps, surrounded by the smell of ancient paper and floor polish. He didn't just read the law, he consumed it. He spent endless, eye-straining hours accessing the expensive LexisNexis database on the library's public computers, tracing every single lawsuit, every property dispute, and every corporate filing related to Vanguard Holdings. He had memorized entire, massive volumes of Black's Law Dictionary. He studied courtroom procedure, the complex rules of evidence, and the brutal art of cross-examination by reading tens of thousands of pages of actual trial transcripts. His brain naturally catalogued precedents, state statutes, and obscure legal loopholes with a terrifying, algorithmic precision. It was during one of these grueling, caffeine-fueled nights, while scrolling through a dizzying array of poorly scanned PDF files, his eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitor, that Richard found the anomaly. He had been staring at the digital copy of his grandmother's supposedly signed deed for the 100th time. Something about the notary stamp near the bottom right corner caught his eye. It was a faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the digital scan, a slight irregularity in the ink distribution of the seal. Richard immediately pulled up the state's notary public registry. He cross-referenced the unique notary ID number stamped on his grandmother's deed. The notary was officially listed as a man named Arthur Pendleton. But Richard, utilizing his flawless, hyper-indexed memory, recalled a fleeting detail from another case he had read 3 weeks prior, a completely unrelated civil suit from upstate New York involving Jasmine Hill's firm. Arthur Pendleton had been listed as a character witness in that case. Richard dug frantically back into the archives, his heart hammering against his ribs, found the old case file, and checked the date of the deposition. Arthur Pendleton had died in a severe multi-car collision in June of 2022. His grandmother's deed was supposedly notarized by Arthur Pendleton in October of 2024. The stamp was a total, indisputable forgery. The deed was a complete fabrication. But Richard didn't stop there. A forged deed was enough to get the case thrown out and save the house, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the burning, righteous anger festering in his chest. Jasmine Hill had intentionally preyed on his grandmother, banking heavily on her poor eyesight, her lack of legal knowledge, and her inability to fight back. She had targeted her because she thought she was weak. Richard wanted to tear the entire corrupt operation down to its foundation. He dug much deeper into the opaque corporate structure of Vanguard Holdings. It was a dizzying labyrinth of shell companies, LLCs registered in tax-friendly Delaware, and offshore holding accounts. It took him 2 solid weeks of tracing wire transfers and corporate filings to follow the paper trail, untangling a massive, deliberate web of dark money. And at the very center of the web, hidden behind 3 distinct layers of corporate anonymity, Richard finally found the smoking gun. Jasmine Hill wasn't just Vanguard's hired legal representation, she was a silent, 40% stakeholder in the holding company. She was personally, financially profiting off the stolen properties, acting as both the prosecuting attorney and the secret buyer, a massive, unpardonable conflict of interest and a severe violation of the Bar Association's strictest ethical codes. Not to mention a slam-dunk case of federal wire fraud. Sitting in the dimly lit library that night, surrounded by towering stacks of yellow legal pads and empty, cold coffee cups, Richard had smiled. It was a cold, calculating, terrifying smile. He wasn't just going to win the case. He was going to utterly destroy her life. The trial had officially moved to its discovery phase, and the sudden, whiplash shift in Richard's courtroom demeanor had not gone unnoticed by Jasmine Hill. Her finely tuned predator instincts were buzzing. She was no longer dealing with a scared teenager pleading for mercy, she was dealing with an anomaly that made her deeply uncomfortable. During a brief morning recess before the opening statements were to commence, Richard was standing out in the echoing marble hallway of the courthouse, getting a tiny cup of water from the fountain, staring blankly at the wall. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open violently, and Jasmine marched out. Her usual aura of unbothered arrogance was visibly cracked, replaced by a tight, irritated tension in her jaw. She clip-clopped over to Richard, her eyes darting sharply around the empty corridor to ensure there were no witnesses. "Listen to me very carefully, kid, because I'm only going to say this once," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper. She stepped aggressively into his personal space, the overwhelming, expensive scent of her Chanel perfume attempting to suffocate him. I don't know what kind of internet law degree you think you've downloaded over the weekend, or what TV show you're trying to emulate, but this isn't a game, this is the real world. And in the real world, big fish eat little fish. And you are a guppy. Richard took a slow, agonizingly calm sip of his water, holding her furious gaze over the rim of the paper cup. He didn't blink. Is there a specific legal proposition you'd like to discuss with opposing counsel, Miss Hill? Or are you just out here to test out your aquatic metaphors? Jasmine's jaw tightened so hard a vein popped in her neck. You think you're clever because you memorized a few state statutes and know how to pronounce fraud in the factum, cute. But Judge Thornton is going to lose his patience with your amateur theatrics very soon. You are going to lose. Your grandmother is going to be thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back, and I will personally ensure that Vanguard Holdings countersues you for our exorbitant legal fees. You will be paying off this debt until you're rotting in a nursing home. Richard crushed the paper water cup slowly in his fist and tossed it casually into the trash can. If you're so confident in your victory, Miss Hill, why are you out here sweating through your silk blouse talking to me? Jasmine's eyes flashed with pure hatred. She reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a crisp, folded white envelope, and shoved it aggressively against his chest. Because, believe it or not, I have a heart. And because a drawn-out trial is tedious and I have a golf game to get to in the Hamptons on Friday, inside this envelope is a certified cashier's check for $25,000. It's a formal settlement offer. You take the money, you and the old lady pack up your junk by Friday, and you sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. 25 grand is more money than a project kid like you has ever seen in his entire life. Take it, buy a nice used car, and start over somewhere else. Richard looked down at the envelope pressed against his sternum. He didn't raise a hand to touch it. $25,000 for a historic brownstone worth almost $2 million on the open market. It was a masterclass in profound, racist insult. Under the New York Rules of Professional Conduct, Rule 4.1, Richard said quietly, his voice dangerously smooth, his memory pulling up the exact text, "A lawyer shall not knowingly make a false statement of material fact or law to a third person." You're offering me literal pennies to walk away from a felony conspiracy you committed. You don't have a heart, Miss Hill. You have a massive, career-ending liability problem, and you're terrified. Jasmine snatched the envelope back, her pristine face flushing a dark, mottled red with absolute fury. Her carefully constructed professional mask completely, totally shattered. "You little punk," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "I am going to bury you. I'm going to humiliate you so badly in front of that judge that you'll never step foot in this courthouse again, and I am going to make sure your grandmother watches you fail." "See you in there, counselor," Richard replied, turning his back on her completely and walking calmly, slowly back toward the courtroom doors. Inside his chest, his heart was hammering wildly against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system, but his mind remained a fortress of ice. The trap was perfectly set. She had taken the bait. She was emotionally compromised and angry, arrogant lawyers always make catastrophic mistakes on the record. The courtroom was back in session. The heavy, brass-studded oak doors were sealed shut by the bailiff, and the gallery was sparse, save for a few curious law students who had heard wild hallway rumors of a pro se teenager taking on the Titan Vanguard Holdings. Jasmine Hill was pacing confidently in front of the jury box, though this was a bench trial decided solely by Judge Thornton. She was fully back in her element, painting a tragic but damning picture of Richard's grandmother as an irresponsible, financially illiterate woman whose memory was fading, who had taken out reckless loans she couldn't possibly repay. To definitively solidify her case, Jasmine called her star witness to the stand. Mr. Marcus Vance, a high-end, aggressive real estate broker who worked exclusively on retainer for Vanguard Holdings. Vance was a slick, heavily cologned man with a spray tan, wearing a bespoke pinstripe suit that easily cost more than the collective net worth of Richard's entire neighborhood block, sitting confidently in the witness box. Vance testified smoothly that he had personally overseen the signing of the deed transfer. He claimed, under oath, that Eleanor Evans was fully coherent, deeply apologetic, and completely aware she was voluntarily signing away her property rights to settle her massive debts. "And Mr. Vance," Jasmine said, stopping her pacing and offering the broker a sickeningly sweet, rehearsed smile. "Just to be entirely clear for the record. Did Mrs. Evans at any point express confusion, hesitation, or distress about the legal document she was signing on October 14th of last year?" "No objection at all," Vance said smoothly, offering a sympathetic shake of his head. "She was very clear-minded. She even thanked us profusely for relieving her of her crushing financial burden. It was an amicable transfer. Thank you, Mr. Vance. That is all." "No further questions, Your Honor," Jasmine said, taking her seat at the plaintiff's table with a triumphant, self-satisfied smirk. She shot a condescending, icy glare across the aisle at Richard. "Your witness, kid, try not to trip over the podium." Judge Thornton looked down at Richard, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Evans, you may cross-examine the witness. I strongly remind you to stick strictly to the facts of his testimony. Do not badger the witness, and do not waste my time." Richard stood up slowly. He didn't bring any legal pads, notes, or index cards with him to the wooden podium. He didn't need them. Every word was burned into his mind. He buttoned his cheap, ill-fitting suit jacket and stared at Mr. Vance in absolute, unblinking silence for 10 agonizing seconds, until the slick broker shifted uncomfortably in his leather seat and cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance," Richard began, his voice ringing clear and authoritative across the silent room. "You just testified under the penalty of perjury that you were physically present in my grandmother's living room on October 14th of last year, at approximately 2 p.m., when she supposedly signed this deed. Is that correct?" "Yes, that is correct," Vance said, letting out a patronizing, breathy chuckle. "I was sitting right across from her at her kitchen table. And you further testified that the document was properly and legally notarized at that exact time, in that exact room, by a registered New York State notary public named Arthur Pendleton?" Jasmine Hill stood up abruptly, her chair scraping the marble. "Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered. The defense is being redundant and wasting the court's valuable time." "Overruled," Judge Thornton rumbled, his eyes narrowing sharply as his decades of intuition sensed exactly where Richard might be going. He leaned over the bench. "Answer the question, Mr. Vance. Was the notary present?" "Yes," Vance said, his smile faltering slightly under the judge's intense scrutiny. "Arthur was there. He checked her ID, and he stamped it." Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the lie. He walked back to his defense table, picked up a single, thin manila folder, and approached the bench. "Your Honor, I would like to formally enter Defense Exhibit A into evidence. It is a certified, state-issued death certificate from the State of New York, Department of Health and Vital Statistics." Jasmine Hill's head snapped up so fast her neck popped, her eyes widened. "Let me see that document," Judge Thornton said, extending a hand. The bailiff took the folder from Richard and handed it up to the judge. Judge Thornton adjusted his glasses, reading the watermarked paper. The color slowly, visibly drained from the judge's ruddy face. He looked up at Richard, a look of profound shock crossing his features, and then slowly turned his terrifying gaze to the witness box. "Mr. Vance," Richard said, stepping away from the podium and walking directly toward the witness box, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with devastating, undeniable authority, "can you please explain to this court, and to Judge Thornton, exactly how Arthur Pendleton notarized a document in my grandmother's living room on October 14th, 2024, when this state-certified death certificate conclusively proves that Mr. Pendleton died in a fatal, head-on car collision on June 3, 2022? Did you conduct a seance in our kitchen, Mr. Vance? Did you conjure a spirit to stamp this deed? Or are you just committing felony perjury in federal court?" Absolute chaos erupted. "Objection, objection, this is a stunt." Jasmine Hill screamed, literally leaping out of her chair, her expensive gold pen clattering loudly to the marble floor. "This is a fabricated document. This is an illegal ambush. We were not provided this in discovery. Sit down and shut your mouth, Miss Hill." Judge Thornton roared, slamming his heavy wooden gavel so hard the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The gallery gasped. The judge turned and glared at the terrified broker on the stand, his face purple with rage. "Mr. Vance, I am going to remind you of your Fifth Amendment rights right now, because you are dangerously close to catching a felony perjury charge in my courtroom. I will ask you once, and if you lie to me, I will have the marshals drag you out of here in chains. Did you or did you not forge a dead man's notary stamp on a legal deed to steal this woman's home?" Vance began to openly hyperventilate. Sweat poured down his spray-tanned forehead, ruining his expensive collar. He looked desperately at Jasmine for help, silently pleading for an objection to save him, but Jasmine was staring at Richard in absolute, unadulterated horror. The normal kid in the cheap suit hadn't just found a minor loophole. He had found a massive, undeniable criminal conspiracy, and he had trapped them perfectly. But Richard wasn't finished. He hadn't even landed the killing blow yet. "Your Honor," Richard interrupted, his voice cutting through the panic, refusing to allow the momentum of the moment to die. "The blatant perjury of Mr. Vance is merely a minor symptom of a much larger, much more malignant disease. The plaintiff claims that Vanguard Holdings is a legitimate corporate entity seeking a lawful, standard eviction. I assert that Vanguard Holdings is a fraudulent, predatory shell corporation, built entirely on blood money. And I have the documentary evidence to prove that the puppet master controlling it all is sitting right here in this room. Tread very, very carefully, Mr. Evans," Judge Thornton warned. Despite the stern tone, the judge was leaning entirely forward over his desk, completely captivated by the surgical, bloodless precision of the teenager's attack. "What, exactly, are you alleging?" Jasmine Hill's face was ashen, the color of wet cement. The predatory confidence, the sneering arrogance, it had all vanished, replaced by the frantic, hyperventilating panic of a trapped animal realizing the cage door has just locked shut. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. He is wildly slandering me in open court. This violates every rule of procedure. I move for a mistrial immediately on the grounds of severe prejudice." "Motion denied," Judge Thornton snapped, not even looking at her. "Proceed, Mr. Evans. Let's see what else you have in that briefcase." Richard walked back to his table, pulled a massive, 3-inch thick black binder from his thrift store briefcase, and slammed it onto the defense table. The heavy thud echoed loudly. "Your Honor, I formally submit Defense Exhibits B through F. These are certified, audited financial records, extensive metadata extracted directly from Vanguard Holdings' Delaware corporate tax filings via the LexisNexis database, and offshore routing numbers subpoenaed from a Cayman Islands private bank account." Richard walked slowly toward Jasmine, stopping just a few feet from her table, looking down at her physically trembling frame. Under the complex corporate veil of Vanguard Holdings is an LLC registered as Apex Ventures, Richard recited entirely from memory, his dark eyes locked mercilessly onto Jasmine's terrified face. Apex Ventures is ostensibly owned by a blind trust to obscure its beneficiaries. But if you forensically trace the routing numbers of the blind trust's quarterly dividend payouts, they land directly, penny for penny, into a private account registered to a J. Hill Consulting. Furthermore, metadata embedded on the original digital draft of the forged deed, the very deed actively submitted to this court by the plaintiff to initiate this trial, shows the original author of the document is registered to an IP address, located physically inside the private office of the law firm of Vanguard and Associates. Richard turned dramatically away from her, addressing the judge. "Miss Jasmine Hill is not just the hired attorney for the plaintiff, Your Honor. She is the plaintiff. She is a secret 40% owner of Vanguard Holdings. She knowingly, maliciously submitted a forged deed, drafted on her own personal computer, bearing the fraudulent stamp of a deceased notary, in a calculated attempt to steal my grandmother's home and flip it for profit. She has committed egregious fraud upon the court, subornation of perjury, criminal conspiracy, and grand larceny." The silence that fell over the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse was absolute, heavy, and profound. It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. The court reporter was staring at Richard, her mouth slightly agape. Jasmine Hill was visibly shaking, her manicured hands trembling so violently they rattled against the mahogany table. She opened her mouth to speak, to object, to scream, to offer any kind of defense, but her vocal cords completely failed her. No words came out. The sheer volume of undeniable, irrefutable, deeply researched evidence stacked against her had completely paralyzed her cognitive functions. She looked at the teenager in the cheap suit, finally, truly realizing what she had provoked. She hadn't been fighting a poor, uneducated kid. She had kicked the hornet's nest of an apex predator of the legal world, a genius disguised in thrift store clothing, and he had just dismantled her entire life. Judge Thornton slowly took off his spectacles, folding them carefully on his desk. He looked down at the massive evidence binder. He looked at the sweating, terrified, weeping broker in the witness stand. And then, he looked at Jasmine Hill with a stare so cold, so filled with absolute disgust, it could have frozen the East River solid. "Miss Hill," Judge Thornton said, his voice dropping to a deadly, terrifying quiet. "Is there anything you would like to say in your defense before I pick up this telephone and involve the Federal Bureau of Investigation?" Jasmine swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the silent room. A single tear of absolute, crushing humiliation streaked down her meticulously contoured cheek, ruining her makeup. "Your Honor, I formally invoke my right to remain silent." The heavy wooden gavel fell, but this time, it didn't sound like a call to order. It sounded like the terrifying thud of a guillotine blade dropping. "This case is dismissed with extreme, permanent prejudice," Judge Thornton announced, his voice vibrating with righteous, unyielding fury. "The deed held by Vanguard Holdings is hereby declared legally null, void, and entirely fraudulent. The property located in Brooklyn belongs unequivocally and forever to Mrs. Eleanor Evans." Furthermore, the judge turned sharply to his bailiff, pointing a stiff finger at the witness stand. "Bailiff, take Mr. Vance into immediate custody for felony perjury. Do not let him leave this room. And contact the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District. I am issuing a bench warrant, right here and right now, for the immediate arrest of Miss Jasmine Hill for fraud upon the court, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. I am also submitting a formal, expedited recommendation to the New York State Bar Association for her immediate and permanent disbarment." The courtroom doors swung open, and two armed federal marshals stepped heavily into the courtroom, their radios crackling. Jasmine Hill, the infamous Black Widow of real estate, the untouchable woman who wore custom Armani and terrorized the vulnerable for sport, was forcibly stood up from her leather chair. The cold, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing sharply through the historic mahogany courtroom was, without a doubt, the sweetest, most vindicating sound Richard had ever heard. As the marshals forcefully led her away, Jasmine looked back over her shoulder at Richard. Her eyes were wide, pleading, totally shattered. All of her immense wealth, her high society status, her country club memberships, and her towering arrogance had been systematically, flawlessly dismantled in less than an hour by a kid she had deemed utterly worthless. Richard didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply reached up, adjusted his cheap, stained burgundy tie, and maintained cold, unwavering eye contact with her until she was dragged out through the heavy wooden doors and out of sight forever. Karma hadn't just knocked on Jasmine Hill's door, it had kicked it down with steel-toed boots and brought the federal government with it. At the defense table, Eleanor Evans was sobbing uncontrollably. But this time, they were not tears of terror or despair. They were tears of overwhelming, profound relief and bursting pride. She stood up on her shaky legs, ignoring the pain in her knees, and wrapped her frail arms tightly around her grandson, burying her wet face in the cheap polyester shoulder of his suit. "You did it, Richie," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "You saved us. You saved our home." Judge Thornton watched the tender embrace from his high bench. The stern, famously unyielding judge felt an unfamiliar lump form thickly in his throat. He cleared it loudly, shuffling his papers to regain his composure. "Mr. Evans," Judge Thornton called out gently. Richard gently let go of his grandmother, offering her a reassuring squeeze, and looked up respectfully at the bench. "Yes, Your Honor." I have presided over this specific courtroom for 30 years, Judge Thornton said, his tone entirely stripped of its previous annoyance and condescension. It was replaced by profound, genuine, almost awestruck respect. I have seen top-tier Harvard graduates, Yale alumni, and absolute legal legends stand exactly where you are standing right now. I have never not once in my entire career seen a display of raw legal brilliance, meticulous research, and courtroom execution quite like what you just executed. Judge Thornton leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. You said earlier you couldn't afford college. But listen to me very carefully, son. If you ever decide you want to go to law school, you come see me. I will personally write your letter of recommendation to any Ivy League university in the country, and I will make a few phone calls to find you a full scholarship, and I don't write letters for just anybody. Thank you, Your Honor, Richard said, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking across his stoic face, the crushing weight of the last 3 months finally lifting off his shoulders. I might just take you up on that. As Richard and his grandmother slowly walked out of the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse, stepping out into the bright, blinding, beautiful sunlight of Foley Square, the world looked entirely different. The towering, glass and steel skyscrapers of Manhattan didn't seem so intimidating or impenetrable anymore. They were just buildings. And 19-year-old Richard Evans had just conclusively proven that no matter how much money, influence, or corrupt power someone had, a sharp mind and the unyielding, undeniable truth were the greatest, most devastating equalizers in the world. If there is one profound thing this incredible story teaches us, it's that you should absolutely never underestimate someone based on where they come from, how much money is in their bank account, or what kind of clothes they wear. Richard Evans didn't have a fancy, expensive degree or $1 million corporate law firm backing him up, but he had something much more powerful, the unyielding truth, an ironclad determination to protect his family, and a brilliant, unstoppable mind. He single-handedly took down a deeply corrupt system and served a cold, hard, unforgettable plate of karma to a predatory lawyer who truly thought she was completely untouchable. What did you think of Richard's incredible courtroom victory and his genius strategy? Would you have had the courage and the grit to stand up to a powerful bully like Jasmine Hill? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this inspiring story of justice, intellect, and